Across the distance, the light from within me shines, sending love to all. Across the distance, your light is fuel that warms me and helps to keep our light burning. Together, we keep the flame of community bright. Today we have Reverend Courtney. We want to welcome her, an interfaith minister, spiritual counselor, and meditation instructor. She is presently a full-time seminary student pursuing a Master's of Divinity in Interreligious Chaplaincy at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, with emphasis on theologies for social justice and UU studies. She lights her chalice with us this morning in Greenwood Lake, New York, and she will begin our service with opening words.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for welcoming me to worship this morning. My pronouns are she, her. Please know that whoever you are, whomever you love, wherever you are joining us from, whatever your beliefs, identity, and expression, status, or life circumstance, we welcome you to worship this morning. I am eager to join with you today in our work of deepening our spiritual lives through community connection and service, and in making love work in our lives and in the world. In this sanctuary of caring that connects us across space and time, we hold in our hearts those for whom parenting is a primary spiritual practice, those who are mourning a loss, those who live with grief or chronic pain, with illnesses seen and unseen, with mental illnesses or addictions, those who have suffered abuse or injustice, those who have experienced job loss or face financial or food insecurity. We are one beloved community, and you are deeply felt, honored, supported, and loved. Let me first say that it would take more than a single service or sermon to move us from being not racist or even less racist to becoming committed anti-racist. Honestly, when I completed today's sermon, it was well over 2 hours long. It is tremendously challenging to approach such a complex subject succinctly while meeting the needs of core concepts and supporting those already established in anti-racism work. Some of us are tired of hearing or talking about race and systemic racism and white supremacy. Some of us think we're already there and that I'm preaching to the choir. Others of us are still learning not to shut down or turn off on a subject that makes us tremendously uncomfortable. Many of us are committed to journeying on a continued path of learning, deepening, and growing into our highest anti-racial ideals as Unitarian Universalists, specifically in this very critical time in our nation. My hope this morning is to introduce you to some ideas that might support you on your journey, because we all arrive from different places in our anti-racism work. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. made the act of assuming personal responsibility for alleviating social harms as ordinary, habitual, and irresistible. Our tribute to him today is the profound gratitude we feel for that gift and a commitment to doing the difficult work of getting in the way of oppression and injustice, of not just settling for being not racist or even being less racist, but of becoming active anti-racist. In order to be an effective anti-racist, both internal and external work is required, and neither is sufficient without the other, because our culture is based on white supremacy and specifically anti-Black racism. The bulk of racism operates unconsciously in our culture, and the longer we are in a culture, the more invisible our culture is. Our only chance of dismantling racial injustice is being more curious about its origins than we are about our comfort. And it's not a comfortable conversation for any of us. It's risky and it's messy. It is haunting work to recall the horrors of our past that are still playing out today. But it is not the work. But is this not the work that we are called to anyway? Is this not the work of spirit to illuminate truth and inspire transformation? It's haunting, but it's also holy. And when we talk about race today, with all the pain packed into that conversation, the holy remains in the room. This doesn't mean that the conversations aren't painful, aren't personal, and aren't charged with emotion. But it does mean we can survive and learn to thrive. We can survive honest discussions about slavery, stolen land, deportation, discrimination, and exclusion. We can identify the harmful politics of gerrymandering, voter suppression, criminal justice laws, and policies that disproportionately affect people of color negatively. And we can expose the actions of white institutions, the history of segregation and white flight, the real impact of all white leadership, the racial disparity in wages and opportunities for advancement. We can lament and mourn. We can be livid and enraged. We can be honest. We can tell the truth. We can trust that spirit is here. We must. It is inspiring to witness the Black Lives Matter protests that have swept across the country and around the world. Millions of people are standing up and speaking up, showing up, risking their own personal safety for the cause of racial justice. And what's more, it's not just one particular community. This might be the largest, most diverse, and most strategically mobilized movement the world has ever seen. As grateful and heartened as I am to see all of this, I also feel an urge to deepen our collective understanding of the role unconscious white privilege and biases play in racial justice. We have the opportunity to confront our errors and reform our structures, but we better get it right. Collective reckoning does not come around often. We must ensure that our movement is firmly planted. Self-education is critical, but alone it is not enough. As Unitarian Universalists, it is core to our theology that everyone has inherent worth, that no one is excluded, and that we all have a voice. And we affirm that it matters as much what we do with our lives as what we believe. Therefore, we must act to dismantle systemic, institutional, and structural racism in all spheres of life. I hope we will commit to doing both the inner and outer work of becoming committed anti-racists together. Today, we will be challenged to journey through our lives, recalling and realizing how the intersections of racism, classism, and white privilege negatively affect our families, friends, and our communities. We will start from the uncomfortable premise that all of us, regardless of our race, have racist ideas embedded within us. But if we can accept this idea collectively without feeling shame or guilt about it, we can begin to honestly grapple with the racism all around us and inside of us too. Our collective journey is to become less racist. Our endpoint should be to become anti-racist. With the work of our hands and the change of our hearts and minds, so much becomes possible. And to that I say amen.
Seeds of Destruction, Thomas Merton writes, "The race question cannot be settled without a profound change of heart, a real shakeup and deep-reaching metanoia, which is Greek for repentance or change of mind, on the part of white America. It is not just a question of a little more goodwill and generosity. It is a question of waking up to crying injustices and deep-seated problems which are ingrained in the present setup and which, instead of getting better, are going to get worse. The purpose of nonviolent protest in its deepest and most spiritual dimensions is then to awaken the conscience of the white people to the awful reality of their injustice and their culpability, so that they will be able to see that the Negro problem is really a white problem, that the cancer of injustice and hate, which is eating white society, is only partly manifested in racial segregation with all its consequences. It is rooted in the heart of the white people themselves." In later writings, Merton elaborates on the pernicious evil of systems of oppression and how we must combat them through the use of faith, hope, and love. When a system can, without resort to overt force, compel people to live in conditions of abjection, helplessness, wretchedness, it is plainly violent. To make people live on a subhuman level against their will, to constrain them in such a way that they have no hope of escaping their condition, is an unjust exercise of force. Those who in some way or other, concur in the oppression and perhaps profit by it, are exercising violence, even though they may be preaching pacifism. And their supposedly peaceful laws, which maintain this spurious kind of order, are in fact instruments of violence and oppression. Growth, survival, and even salvation may depend on the ability to sacrifice what is fictitious and unauthentic in the construction of one's moral, religious, or national identity. Friends, this is precisely why understanding how our social location is formed and why it must be challenged. Continuing with the reading. One must then enter upon a different creative task of reconstruction and renewal. This task can be carried out only in the climate of faith, of hope, and of love. These three must be present in some form, even if they amount only to a natural belief in the validity and significance of human choice, a decision to invest human life with some shadow of meaning, a willingness to treat other people as other selves. This profound change of heart, a real shakeup and deep-reaching metanoia, is the work we are here to do today. Here ends the reading.
The majority of my life, I never thought of myself as a racist. I was absolutely not racist. Having a military upbringing, I had a wealth of international friends. My confrontations with racism were primarily from visits with extended family from West Virginia and South Carolina, whom I awkwardly tolerated and apologized for on the back end. My understanding of racism was terribly limited. Now I realize the mere intellectual recognition of racism, and particularly identifying racism within individual behavior, is only a beginner's step. I've had the opportunity to examine in depth the intersections of racism, classism, white privilege, and to explore with others how I might participate in direct action to combat racism. New understandings of the all-pervasive and insidious nature of racism, underscoring our culture, has changed my thinking and behavior. The more I have kept my heart and mind open, the more capable I am of seeing how invisible racism can be for so many of us, and what parts I play in unknowingly keeping it invisible. I recently had a conversation with a friend who described our current racial inequities as essentially a Black problem. That is, if poor Black people merely applied themselves better, they could achieve the American dream and we wouldn't be seeing these inequities today. Had I not had the experience of my childhood embedded in inequities and the training of my seminaries, I might have too easily have agreed with her. Anyone has the opportunity to achieve the American dream, right? Isn't that what we're taught? After all, my family was poor and worked their tails off to rise from poverty. But my family had a significant advantage. Simply put, we are white. My family didn't face the systemic housing and lending discrimination still prevalent today. My family built their wealth on home ownership, which is the primary wealth building opportunity historically and presently denied or withheld from so many Black Americans and people of color. Thankfully, learning to get comfortable with talking about racism and discovering how racism operates unconsciously in our culture and in myself, I've become better equipped to do as much as I can and to do even more as I learn even more. I took as much time as possible that day with my friend to discuss how our culture makes racism invisible and how easy it is for folks to say that anybody can achieve the American dream, especially when we've started out from a social location of power and privilege. Now, how do white people first engage with white supremacy culture? Often we don't. Many of us reject the idea that racism is still present and still harming people. We say we've had a Black president, how bad could it be? We say proudly that we are colorblind and that we don't care what color people are, signaling by our very mention that we are not taking the whole matter terribly seriously. Colorblindness is a real problem. It is only in a white dominant society that we can look upon ourselves as colorless and colorblind. Read white. Someone who is not cognizant of color is someone who is not cognizant of the pain of those who suffer because of color. One often hears, even from the pulpit, rhetoric such as the following: in the eyes of God, color does not matter. I consider such a statement, no matter how good the intentions behind it, to be counterproductive. To speak as if color were of no concern to God or to us is to perpetuate the denigration of color. Surely God transcends color, as God can be argued to transcend anything, really. But it is not because God is colorless, again, read white, but because God is colorful and cognizant of the beauty of each color. To say that we are colorblind, we are indeed blind folk. This colorless cultural bias keeps racism invisible even to ourselves. How many times have we heard the phrase, "I am not racist"? Probably more times than we can count. Well, even here, I don't have a racist bone in my body, but this is often followed by a coordinated conjunction such as but I've read that Black people take advantage of the welfare system more than others. More recently, we hear, "I am not racist, but all lives matter." I would argue that being colorblind or saying all lives matter is synonymous with being not racist. It presumes itself neutral. But the opposite of racist is not racist. It is anti-racist. If we're in favor of the colorblind, the white status quo, and remaining blind to color, we are in favor of perpetuating our current inequities. This not racist position is not pacifism or neutrality. Turning a blind eye to violence against humanity does participate in supporting it. The mere fact that we are white and are not punished for our color is what gives us the obliviousness to color. And we do not suffer any penalty for remaining oblivious. Worse, our current setup entails that we benefit from it, which is all too often why we do nothing about it. If we're willing to move from being not racist to being anti-racist, we're going to have to confront these sorts of white cultural attitudes within ourselves. Taking a close look at our social location helps us uncover these blind spots tremendously. An individual's social location is defined as the combination of factors including, but not limited to, gender, race, class, education, age, ability, religion, sexual orientation, and geographical location. This makes social location particular to each individual. That is, social location is not exactly the same for any two individuals. Social location is the social position an individual holds within their society and is based upon social characteristics deemed to be important or desirable by any given society. Sociologists argue that social location of an individual profoundly influences who they are, who they become, their interactions with others, self-perception, life opportunities, and life outcomes. When discussions of privilege or discrimination come up, it's only a matter of time until someone of privilege says, "You're seeing things that just aren't there." Now, it's unlikely that other social locations are suffering from collective delusion. So if it's not collective delusion, then how can two locations see things so differently? The answer lies in how our social location affects our judgment and our experiences. We do not necessarily see the world the way it is. We see the world from our social location perspective. We see the world the way that we are. So this is why it's so important for us to learn how to acknowledge our own social locations. We can more readily examine interactions within and between broader systems of privilege and power and oppression, and we can reflect on how our social locations affect our inaction. We may be involved in a deep-seated, unconscious inability to see what's right in front of us. We may not be able to see the depth of continuing white supremacist dialogue and practices today. Knowing our social location biases helps us to accept that we are not omniscient. An unconscious bias left unaddressed creates personal, interpersonal, and organizational practices that privilege some and oppress others. The good news is that once unconscious bias is acknowledged, the journey of dismantling it is productive and, for many people, freeing. The bottom line is it's hard to fix a problem if we can't see it. If someone tells us they have had experiences that are totally different from our own, that doesn't necessarily mean they are false. It is clear by our current socio-political crisis that reality is a relative to social location. No two social locations are the same, and therefore no two realities are the same. Understanding this helps us bridge the gap between truly trying to understand and help each other through our blind spots and otherwise dismissing each other outright for seeing something that isn't true or isn't there. So now we're going to take a couple of quick minutes to create a map of our own social location. To do this, we will consider aspects that inform who we are as provided by this chart that I'm about to share. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see this? Yep, great. Okay, so the groups people belong to are because of their place or position in history, biological and environmental factors. Some of these we have agency over, we have choice, others we do not. But they speak to the sources of power and vulnerability which determine our social agreements and the power dynamics of our interactions within our culture. Each group membership confers a certain set of expected rules, social rules and roles, power and privilege or lack thereof, which heavily influence our identity and how we see and engage with the world. As we can see here, sources of power and vulnerability are predominantly derived from the prevailing American cultural norms we wrestle with today and hope to disrupt for greater and greater equities for humanity. So now I'm going to go ahead and take away the example answers. And let's just take a quick minute to fill in this chart for ourselves visually. So now that we've taken a moment with this chart, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that are going to help us dig a little bit deeper. What are your social statuses, and are those statuses shared by the majority of the people in your community or not? What types of experiences are you more or less likely to have because of your social location? Given your answer to the first two questions, what biases or blind spots might you have because of your social location? How is your life affected by social privilege? In what ways have you or do you benefit or not at all from America's prevailing cultural power dynamic? So now that we've checked our power, privilege, and biases, now what? I'm going to present 5 strategies for how to make the best out of these uncomfortable moments of dealing with personal social privilege and vulnerabilities, and to confront racist social inequities in general. Our first strategy is that we must continually expand our definition of racism. Race-focused conversations derail not only because of us being unaware of our social location, but because people are using the same term in different ways. One of the challenges of communicating effectively about race is to move from the narrow and individualized definition of racism to a more comprehensive and systemic awareness. In order to illuminate racism, we need to name it, frame it, and explain it. The expanded definition of racism I'm going to offer here, although not exhaustive, is grounded in critical race theory. 1, racism is ordinary. It is the normal way that society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. 2, racism serves the interest of both white people in power, the elites materially, and working class white people physically, and therefore neither group has much incentive to fight it. 3, race and races are social and political constructs, categories that society invents and manipulates when convenient. In reality, our differences as human beings are dwarfed by what we have in common. 4, societies choose to ignore this and assign characteristics to whole groups of people in order to advance the idea of race and ensure the superiority of whiteness. 5, the power elite racializes different groups at different times to achieve economic agendas, continually and repeatedly prioritizing profits over people. While our law enforcement and prisons grow, education, housing, healthcare, and social safety net programs starve. Indeed, we have chosen criminalization to respond to poverty, addiction, mental health, and homelessness, all symptoms of a larger divestment from public good driven largely by the profit motives of capitalism. The outcome of these divestments disproportionately disadvantage Black Americans and people of color. Yes, systemic racism is inextricably connected to economic ideologies. Our second strategy is to actively listen while accepting that other people experience the world differently due to our social locations. When those around us tell us that our words or actions are hurtful or exclusionary, it is very easy to bunker down behind all of our defenses. But if we try with all of our might to convince somebody that they've got it all wrong, we shouldn't be surprised if they tried just as hard to convince us that our social privilege is real and creating problems. Instead of becoming defensive, we can try our best to really listen to what those around us are saying, hear them and repeat back to them as many times as it takes until the other person agrees that you understand. We, the beloved community, can respond to those among us who resist the reality of white supremacy, including ourselves, by simply being good listeners, providing an open and non-anxious presence for our conversation partner. The more we practice, the less our discomfort and defensiveness. The second time we might be less afraid, and the third time less afraid still. The third strategy is to move from getting called out to getting feedback. The first step towards doing anything about racism and white supremacy culture is to accept that it is real, it is affecting us personally, and it is affecting our beloved community. From this place, being called out is better framed as being given feedback from someone who cares about us and our shared communities. It is never fun to have the spotlight put on us for something negative. But personally, I am thankful that I have had a bevy of friends who have had the courage to cherish all of our difficult conversations. It's how we've grown. If we can move away from the idea that we are being called out for social privilege and instead welcome feedback, we can get to work on dismantling the systems of oppression in society and make our community a better place for everyone to live in. Another solution is to stop thinking of the term racist as a pejorative or accusatory term, and instead to start thinking of it as a simple and helpful description so that we can actively engage in this difficult work of becoming anti-racist rather than getting stuck in the shame, guilt, fear, and denial that can easily accompany these conversations. There is no magic bullet, but rather an ongoing eagerness to grow in our humility, self-awareness, self-education, so that welcome dialogue can open up new doors and new bridges. We, the beloved community, can respond to those among us who are in denial about white supremacy by gently and non-judgmentally being witness to its reality. We can bring up the topic. We can create spaces for others to receive feedback by talking about our own experiences of being given feedback, of our understanding of being colorblind and describing what changed for us. We can comment on racism as it appears around us. We can ask questions that reveal double standards hidden in some kinds of talk about race, such as inquiring when somebody mentions Black on Black crime, why they're not also talking about white on white crime, since almost all crime is interracial due to segregation. The fourth strategy is to act individually, but be thinking institutionally. Once we've accepted that we have social privilege, it's time to get to work on ourselves and our community. People with privilege and power especially need to use it to ensure everyone in our community is being treated fairly. First, we start with ourselves. We do that deep, reflective listening and thinking about our social location, which is the work that we've started with here today. But now comes the harder part, changing our communities. If we really want to work against social inequality, we have to act individually, but be thinking institutionally. To change things institutionally, we have to focus on laws, policies, and structures that guide our communities. Being anti-racist means learning about and identifying inequities and disparities that give, in particular, white people or any racial group material advantages over people of color. Racist ideas and policies are written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that maintain racial inequity in every sector of private and public life, including politics, healthcare, the judicial system, education, employment, home ownership, transportation access, food access, religion. This is a complex institutional systemic issue. So we need to start thinking about the groups and organizations that we are a part of and how they are affected by social inequality. As a society, we often assume that every group or organization is unaffected by racism. We can make a radical change in society if we simply assumed that every organization is affected by social privilege. We should take for granted that every group and organization does have the potential to create systems of inequality and or reinforce ideologies of oppression. Once we began identifying racial disparities, we examine whether our own views or beliefs have neutralized, justified, or promoted racial inequity. If we don't know whether our beliefs or views are racist, we should listen to frontline racial justice activists, advocates, and organizations that have outlined anti-racist positions and policies. Let that listening prompt deeper reflection to develop those spiritual muscles needed to confront racist cultural currents. One way to do this is to keep an anti-racism journal that includes daily notes about when we took an anti-racist stance or action, or when we thought or said something racist or stayed silent. Another way is to get involved in organizations in our community that are fighting policies that uphold racial inequities. We can use power and privilege to become socially and politically active by getting into positions of power to change racist policies in any setting where they exist, be it government, our schools, our work, or our religious community, to encourage further self-education on white supremacy culture and to affect policy change. The point is to commit to some form of action that has the potential to change racist ideas and policies. What we hope to arrive at is a lifelong commitment and ongoing practice and process of anti-racist action. At the conclusion of our work here today, shortly, I'm going to be putting a link in the chat for resources and inspiration. It is by no means an exhaustive document, but I hope it will provide avenues for engagement and that it might be adopted as the beginning of an ongoing collaboration and development. In order to know where we're going, we should define what an utopia America, anti-racist America looks like. A societal culture where racism is no longer intersecting with other bigotries to manipulate people away from their greatest potential. where we can honestly share our racial history without falling back into defensiveness, fear, guilt, or shame. A reframing of the achievement gap as the opportunity gap, where instead of standardizing our tests or closing our schools, we standardize resources and open first-class schools for all. Where high-quality healthcare is as universal as living wages and fresh food. Where instead of stocking prisons with poor and mentally disabled people of color, we restock those communities with high-paying jobs and mental health services. Where guns are as properly managed as police officers fearing for their lives. Where voting is easy and accessible for all citizens. Where love and hope guides us instead of fear and white fragility. Where natives and immigrants become one. Where all can be fully human and embrace humanity fully. People like Martin Luther King Jr. strove unceasingly for this vision. His legacy and leadership still shepherds us today, but it is up to us now together to continue to do this hard work, to take consistent and conscious action, to make this vision of a beloved community our living reality. Cultural revolutions do not happen only in grand moments in public view, but also in small pockets of people coming together to inhabit a new way of being. We birth the beloved community by becoming the beloved community. When a critical mass of people practice together in community as parts of movements for justice, we create the world we want here and now. Unitarian Universalism is taking an important step to committing to this work as an entire body, a beloved community against white supremacy. I'm eager to see to fruition the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism. It reads, "We, the member congregants of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions." To do this, we must move from the passive positions of simply being not racist that perpetuate the violence of racism, to an anti-racial understanding and a pledge to be part of the solution. Fighting systemic racism is going to be exhausting. But if white people especially are willing to put in the work, the legwork on white supremacy cultural in general, we'll get there. Addressing these very issues allows us to live, love, move, and have our being in the theology we profess. We, the beloved community, proclaim our commitment to a world bursting with joy for all people. We don't live in that world yet, but we are working our way toward it, one person at a time, one action at a time, one community at a time, and we are taking care of each other along the way. To that I say amen. Thank you for inviting me to share these perspectives and to grow with you today. I hope you will continue to stay in touch and stay engaged. May the spirit of freedom and peace for all be answered in the highest calling of your heart. Let us all find a way to get in the way of injustice. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., let us rise up with greater readiness, let us stand with greater determination, and let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be. May it be so.
We've come to the end of our service, and I will read some closing words and extinguish this chalice. But I welcome everybody to stay after for the virtual coffee hour, where we can chat about the sermon today. We are one. Never has it been more true than now. We extinguish this flame, but the sparks within us remain alight. From each of us, in our supposed solitude, the signals buzz and hum, sparkling through space, one to another, connecting us invisibly but palpably. We are one, and from every window our light shines.